Deep in the forests of northern Michigan, where tall pines swayed gently in the autumn breeze, John Miller adjusted his orange hunting vest and checked his compass one more time. He'd been tracking deer since sunrise, following their familiar paths through the dense undergrowth. With 25 years of hunting experience under his belt, John knew these woods like the back of his hand. The morning had started like any other hunting day: crisp air, the soft crunch of leaves under his boots, and that peaceful solitude that only nature could provide. But something felt different today. Maybe it was the way the birds had gone quiet in certain areas, or how the usual deer tracks seemed to venture off in unusual directions. As John navigated through a particularly thick patch of brush, he caught a sound that made him freeze in his tracks. At first, he thought it might be an injured animal, a soft, pained whimpering that seemed to float on the wind. He stood perfectly still, listening intently. Years of hunting had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now, those instincts were telling him this wasn't any ordinary animal sound. The whimpering came again, clearer this time. It sounded distinctly like a dog, but out here, nearly 15 miles from the nearest town. That didn't make any sense. John had encountered plenty of hunting dogs over the years, but they were always with their owners, wearing bright orange vests and tracking collars. Forgetting about his original pursuit, John began moving carefully toward the sound. The whimpering grew louder as he pushed through a dense thicket of young trees. His heart was beating faster now, not from exertion, but from a growing sense that something wasn't right. Then he saw it. In a small clearing ahead, an enormous old oak tree stood like a sentinel among its younger neighbors. Tied to its massive trunk was a German shepherd, its proud frame now hunched and trembling. The sight stopped John dead in his tracks. The dog's ribs were visible through its dulled coat, and its eyes held a mixture of fear and exhaustion that made John's chest tighten. A frayed rope, tied in hasty knots, kept the animal tethered to the tree. This wasn't a dog that had accidentally gotten lost or run away. Someone had deliberately left it here. "Hey there, buddy," John called out softly, keeping his voice low and gentle. The dog's ears perked up, but its body stiffened, unsure whether to trust this new human presence. John noticed how the animal held itself. There was something distinctly disciplined about its posture, even in its weakened state. Moving slowly, John set down his hunting rifle and removed his gloves, wanting to appear as non-threatening as possible. The dog watched his every move with intelligent eyes that seemed to hold stories of their own. As John got closer, he could see that despite its current condition, this was no ordinary stray. The dog's bearing spoke of training and purpose. "It's okay," John continued speaking in soothing tones, gradually closing the distance between them. "I'm not going to hurt you." He reached into his pack and pulled out his water bottle and some beef jerky he'd packed for his lunch. The dog's nose twitched at the smell of food, but it maintained its position, as if waiting for permission. That's when John noticed something else that made his blood run cold. Around the base of the tree, partially hidden by fallen leaves, were several white envelopes. They looked weathered but intentionally placed, weighted down by what appeared to be military gear. One campus bag, and what looked like a service vest. The dog watched intently as John knelt down to examine these items, its demeanor changing slightly. There was recognition in those eyes and something else. Hope, perhaps? John's mind was racing with questions. Who would leave a clearly well-trained dog out here? And what was the story behind these mysterious items left behind? As he settled into a crouch, still maintaining a safe distance, John began to take in more details. The dog's collar, though dirty, looked expensive, the kind used for working dogs. A tag dangled from it, and John could just make out a name: Max. "Max," he said quietly, testing the name. The dog's ears pricked forward immediately, and its tail gave the slightest wag. "Is that your name, boy?" "Max." The response was subtle but unmistakable. This was definitely Max, and he clearly knew his name. But that only led to more questions. John had been hunting these woods for decades, and he'd never seen anything like this. The whole scene felt like walking into the middle of a story, one he desperately needed to understand. Time seemed to stand still in that clearing as hunter and dog regarded each other. The morning sun filtered through the canopy above, casting dappled shadows that danced across Max's fur. Birds had resumed their calling, and a light breeze rustled the leaves, but John barely noticed. His focus was entirely on the mystery before him. His hunting trip forgotten, John knew he had stumbled upon something important. Whatever had led to this moment, to Max being tied to this tree with these carefully placed items, it wasn't a simple case of abandonment. There was purpose here, and pain, and perhaps even desperation. As John settled in to gain Max's trust and figure out his next steps, he couldn't shake the feeling that this chance encounter would lead to something much bigger than a disrupted hunting trip. In his gut, he knew this was just the beginning of a story that needed to be told. The wind picked up slightly, carrying with it the first hints of approaching rain. John glanced at the darkening sky through the treetops, then back at Max. Whatever happened next, he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't leaving this clearing without making sure this dog was safe. With careful movements, John reached for one of the envelopes near the tree. Max watched him intently, but made no move to stop him. Something told John that these letters would hold the key to understanding how this trained, dignified animal had ended up alone in these woods. As his fingers closed around the first envelope, he had no idea that he was about to uncover a story that would change not only his life, but the lives of everyone it touched. The morning's peaceful hunting trip had transformed into something else entirely: a mystery, a rescue mission, and perhaps most importantly, the beginning of a remarkable tale of loyalty, sacrifice, and hope. As John settled in to read the first letter, Max's eyes never left his face, as if knowing that finally, help had arrived. With trembling hands, John opened the first envelope, careful not to tear the weather-worn paper. Max watched intently, his eyes following every movement as if he understood the significance of these letters. The paper inside was covered in neat, purposeful handwriting that spoke of military precision. As John began to read, the world around him seemed to fade away. The letter was dated just 2 weeks ago, and its contents made his heart sink. To whoever finds Max, it began, "I'm sorry for what I'm about to tell you, and even more sorry for what I had to do." The writer identified himself as James Cooper, a veteran who had served 3 tours overseas with Max as his military working dog. The bond between them was evident in every word. Max wasn't just a service dog, he was family. They'd survived firefights together, saved lives together, and helped each other heal from the invisible wounds of war. John glanced at Max, seeing him in a new light. This wasn't just any German shepherd. This was a hero, a soldier in his own right. The dog's posture, despite his weakened state, still held that military bearing. Even now, he sat at attention, waiting patiently as John uncovered his story. The letter went on to explain how James had struggled after returning home. The transition to civilian life had been rough, but having Max by his side had made it bearable. They'd been inseparable, just as they'd been during their service. But then James's health had taken a turn for the worse. John's hands clenched as he read about James's deteriorating condition. The veteran had been diagnosed with a serious illness that required extended hospitalization. With no family to turn to and his savings dwindling, he'd faced an impossible choice. The hospital wouldn't allow Max to stay with him, and he couldn't afford proper care for his faithful companion. Reaching for the second envelope, John found photographs that made his throat tight. There was Max in full military gear, standing proud beside his handler in a desert landscape. Another showed them in happier times, Max's tongue lolling out in a doggy grin as James knelt beside him in a sunny backyard. The joy in both their faces was unmistakable. The next letter revealed more of their story. James had tried everything to keep Max with him. He'd reached out to various organizations, but the waiting lists were long and his time was short. In the end, he'd made the heartbreaking decision to leave Max where he thought someone would find him, in these hunting grounds that he knew were regularly patrolled. "I chose this spot carefully," the letter explained. "Hunters come through here often, and they tend to be good people who understand loyalty and responsibility. I'm hoping whoever finds Max will have the heart to help him." Around the tree, John discovered more items that painted a picture of Max's life. A well-worn service vest with patches indicating his military achievements, training certificates showing his extensive skills, and even his favorite toy: a tough rubber ball that had clearly seen better days. But it was the final envelope that truly caught John's eye. Unlike the others, this one was sealed in plastic, protected from the elements. Inside, he found detailed medical records, vaccination certificates, and training documentation. James had thought of everything, making sure whoever found Max would have all they needed to care for him properly. The last letter was the hardest to read. James's writing was shakier here, the words carrying the weight of his pain. Max has been my guardian angel, my best friend, and my reason for getting up on the darkest days. Leaving him here is the hardest thing I've ever done, but I have to believe this gives him the best chance at a good life. Please, if you're reading this, help him find that life. John looked at Max again, understanding now why the dog maintained such composure even in distress. He wasn't just abandoned, he was waiting, following his last order from the person he trusted most in the world. The thought made John's chest ache. Standing slowly, John spoke softly to Max. Your person did everything he could for you, buddy. He made sure you'd be found. Max's ears perked up, and this time his tail wagged with more enthusiasm. It was as if he could sense that John understood now that he wasn't just another passerby. Looking through the remaining items, John found James's contact information at the VA hospital where he was being treated. It was about 2 hours away, not close, but not impossible. The gears in John's mind started turning as he formed a plan. Rain had started to fall lightly through the canopy, creating a gentle patter on the leaves above. John carefully gathered all the documents, protecting them inside his waterproof hunting pack. Then he turned his attention back to Max, who was watching him with renewed interest. What do you say we get you out of here? John asked, reaching slowly for the rope that held Max to the tree. I think it's time we went to find James. At the mention of his handler's name, Max's entire demeanor changed. His tail wagged faster, and his eyes lit up with hope. As John worked to untie the knots, he made a silent promise, not just to Max, but to James as well. This story wasn't going to end here in these woods. Somehow, he would find a way to help them both. After all, you don't leave a soldier behind, even if that soldier has 4 legs and a tail. The rain began to fall harder as John finally freed Max from his tether. Together, they stood in the clearing, an unlikely pair brought together by chance and circumstance. But as Max pressed close to John's leg, seeking both comfort and guidance, John knew this was just the beginning of their journey. The walk back to John's truck was slower than usual, with Max staying close by his side. Despite his weakened state, the German Shepherd's training was evident in how he matched John's pace perfectly, stopping when he stopped, moving when he moved. The rain had picked up, creating a soft drumming sound on the forest canopy above them. John's mind raced as they walked, piecing together everything he'd learned from the letters. The story of James and Max touched something deep within him, perhaps because his own father had been a veteran, or maybe it was simply the undeniable bond between a soldier and his dog that resonated so strongly. Every few minutes, John would glance down at Max, still hardly believing what fate had brought into his path today. The dog's fur was matted and dirty, but there was an unmistakable dignity in his bearing. Even now, struggling with hunger and exhaustion, Max carried himself like the military dog he was. When they finally reached John's old blue pickup truck, parked at the end of a narrow dirt road, Max hesitated for the first time. It's okay, boy, John reassured him, opening the passenger door. We're going to get you some help. As if understanding the words, Max carefully climbed into the truck, settling himself on the worn seat with military precision. The drive to town gave John time to think. His first stop would be Dr. Thompson's veterinary clinic. She'd been taking care of local animals for decades, and John trusted her completely. As they drove, he kept one hand on Max's head, feeling the dog lean into his touch, seeking comfort and reassurance. The small town of Pine Creek came into view through the rain-streaked windshield. It wasn't much, just a main street with a handful of shops, a diner, and Dr. Thompson's clinic, but it was home to people who looked out for each other. John had a feeling he'd need that community spirit for what lay ahead. The bell above the clinic door chimed as John led Max inside. The waiting room was empty except for Linda, the receptionist who'd worked there since John was a kid. Her eyes widened at the sight of the bedraggled German Shepherd. "John Miller, what have you found this time?" she asked, already reaching for the phone to call Dr. Thompson. John managed a small smile. He had a reputation for bringing in injured wildlife he found while hunting, but this was different. While they waited, John showed Linda the letters, watching as her eyes filled with tears. She'd lost her own son in Afghanistan 5 years ago. The military connection hit close to home. By the time Dr. Thompson emerged from the back room, Linda was already making calls to local veterans groups. Dr. Thompson's examination of Max was thorough but gentle. The dog remained perfectly still throughout, responding to commands with immediate obedience. "He's dehydrated and undernourished," she explained, running her hands along Max's ribs, "but considering what he's been through, he's in remarkably good shape. James must have left him very recently." The mention of James's name made Max's ears perk up. John shared what he'd learned from the letters, watching as Dr. Thompson's professional demeanor softened. She'd treated many service dogs over the years and understood their special nature. "The good news is, there's nothing here we can't fix," she said, preparing some fluids for Max. "The real question is, what happens next?" She gave John a knowing look. In a small town like Pine Creek, taking on someone else's troubles meant becoming part of their story. John sat beside Max as the dog received his treatment, scratching behind his ears and speaking softly to him. The letters he found painted a picture of a man who'd sacrificed everything for his country, only to find himself alone when he needed help the most. The thought didn't sit right with John. Linda poked her head into the examination room, her face brightening. "I've got some news," she said. "I'd reached out to the Veterans Support Network in the next county. They're already familiar with James's case. Apparently, he'd contacted them before about help with Max, but their resources were stretched thin." That's when the pieces started falling into place. The VSN had contacts at the VA hospital where James was being treated. With their help, John could not only check on James's condition, but potentially find a way to reunite him with Max. Dr. Thompson added another layer of hope. "I can provide documentation showing Max is in good health and up to date on his vaccinations. That might help with any paperwork the hospital needs." She paused, watching as Max leaned his head against John's leg. "He's a special dog, John. Whatever you're planning, count me in." As the afternoon wore on, more people got involved. Word spread through Pine Creek about the military dog found in the woods and his handler in the hospital. The town's veterans began making calls, pulling strings, and offering help. This wasn't just about a dog anymore, it was about taking care of one of their own. Max dozed on a blanket in the corner of the clinic, his body finally relaxing as the fluids and care began to take effect. John sat nearby, making calls and taking notes. The VA hospital was his next stop, but he wanted to have a plan in place first. James had done everything he could to protect Max. Now it was time for others to step up and help them both. Linda brought in coffee and sandwiches as evening approached. "The VSN coordinator is sending over some paperwork," she said, sitting down beside John. "They think they might have a solution, but they need a temporary guardian for Max while they sort things out." John looked at the sleeping German Shepherd, remembering the words from James's letters. He thought about his own empty house, quiet since his wife passed 2 years ago. Sometimes the right path forward was clear as day, you just had to be willing to take the first step. "Max can stay with me," he said simply. "For as long as it takes." The words felt right as soon as he said them. After all, that's what communities did. They took care of their own, even those they hadn't met yet. As the rain continued to fall outside, plans began to take shape in the warm light of the veterinary clinic. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now, Max was safe and help was on the way. John settled back in his chair, watching the steady rise and fall of the dog's chest as he slept. Sometimes the best hunting days were the ones where you didn't catch what you were looking for, but instead found something you didn't even know you were seeking. Early the next morning, John's truck rumbled down his gravel driveway with Max sitting alertly in the passenger seat. The German Shepherd had spent the night at John's house, and despite being in a strange place, his military training showed through. He'd been the perfect guest, quiet and watchful. John had converted his mudroom into a comfortable space for Max, with fresh blankets and water, but the dog had barely slept. Instead, he'd stationed himself by the front window, as if keeping guard. It was clear that even after everything he'd been through, Max hadn't forgotten his training or his sense of duty. The previous night, after leaving Dr. Thompson's clinic, they'd stopped at the local pet store. The owner, Tom, had stayed open late after hearing their story. He'd helped John gather everything Max might need: a new collar, a proper leash, high-quality food, and even a few toys. When John had reached for his wallet, Tom had waved him off. "This one's on the house," he'd said quietly. "My brother served too." Now, as the morning sun painted the sky in soft pinks and oranges, they were headed to meet with Richard, the local Veterans Support Network coordinator. He'd arranged to meet them early, understanding the urgency of the situation. Max sat up straighter as they pulled into the small office parking lot, his training evident in every movement. Richard was already waiting outside, a sturdy man with kind eyes and silver hair. He'd served himself, and it showed in how he approached Max, with respect rather than just affection. The German shepherd responded immediately to his presence, recognizing a fellow soldier. "Let's see what we can do for your friend," Richard said, leading them inside. His office was small but organized, with military photos and certificates covering the walls. Max settled at John's feet as they sat down, but his eyes never stopped scanning the room. Old habits die hard. "I spoke with the VA hospital last night," Richard began, pulling out a thick folder. "James Cooper is there, and he's stable, but his situation is complicated." He explained that James was battling not just physical illness, but also the aftermath of his service, the invisible wounds that so many veterans carried. "The good news is we've got options," Richard continued. "There's a program specifically designed for veterans with service dogs. They understand the therapeutic value of keeping handlers and their dogs together during treatment." His fingers drummed thoughtfully on the folder. "The challenge is getting all the paperwork in order and finding temporary care for Max during the transition." John leaned forward. "I've already said Max can stay with me as long as needed. My house is secure, I've got a fenced yard, and I work from home most days." He felt Max's head press against his leg, as if the dog was affirming his words. Richard nodded approvingly. "That helps tremendously. Now, here's what we need to do next." He laid out a plan that would take them through the next few days. First, they'd need to get Max certified by a professional trainer to confirm his service dog status, though given his military background, this would likely be a formality. "I know just the person," Richard said. "She specializes in working with military dogs. She can meet us this afternoon." He pulled out his phone, sending a quick message. "The harder part will be navigating the hospital bureaucracy, but I've got some contacts there who can help smooth the way." As they discussed the details, Max remained alert but calm. Occasionally, his ears would prick up at certain words or phrases, showing his understanding went deeper than most people might expect. When Richard mentioned James's name, Max's tail would give a slight wag, hope evident in his eyes. The morning turned into a flurry of activity. They visited a professional photographer to document Max's current condition and get proper ID photos. The local radio station caught wind of the story and asked to do a brief interview, helping to spread the word about James's situation. By lunchtime, offers of help were pouring in from all over the county. The professional trainer, Katie, met them at a local park that afternoon. She had decades of experience with military working dogs and knew exactly how to evaluate Max. The German shepherd responded to her commands perfectly, demonstrating his training hadn't faded despite his recent ordeal. "He's exceptional," Katie said after the evaluation, her voice full of admiration. "The bond between him and his handler must be incredible for him to maintain this level of training even after what he's been through." She filled out the necessary certification papers on the spot, adding her own letter of recommendation to their growing file. Throughout the day, Max stayed close to John, but it was clear his heart belonged to James. Whenever they discussed plans for reuniting him with his handler, Max's attention would sharpen, his whole body seeming to lean toward the possibility of seeing James again. As evening approached, they made one final stop at Dr. Thompson's clinic for a follow-up check. Max's condition was already improving with proper food and care, but more importantly, they needed her final medical clearance for the hospital paperwork. "Everything looks good," she said, giving Max an affectionate pat. "I've written up my report emphasizing his excellent health and temperament. The hospital would be hard-pressed to find any medical reason to keep them apart." Back in John's truck, heading home as the sun set, Max seemed more relaxed than he had been since John found him. Perhaps he sensed that things were moving in the right direction, that people were working to reunite him with James. John glanced at his passenger, seeing not just a dog, but a soldier who'd never stopped being faithful to his mission and his partner. "We're going to fix this, buddy," he promised softly. "Tomorrow, we're going to go find James." Max's tail thumped against the seat, and for the first time, John saw what might have been a real smile on the dog's face. Sometimes, the best kind of rescue wasn't just about saving someone, it was about bringing them back to where they belonged. The 2-hour drive to the VA hospital felt longer than usual. John had woken up early, his mind too full of thoughts to sleep. He'd found Max already awake, sitting by the door as if he knew this was an important day. The German Shepherd had eaten his breakfast quickly but carefully, military precision evident even in this simple act. Now, as they drove through the morning traffic, Max sat perfectly still in the passenger seat, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. The stack of paperwork Richard had helped prepare sat securely in John's briefcase: medical records, service documentation, training certificates, and letters of support from various professionals. The closer they got to the hospital, the more alert Max became. His ears twitched at every sound, and his nose worked overtime, sampling the changing air through the cracked window. It was as if he could sense they were getting closer to James, his whole body vibrating with barely contained anticipation. They pulled into the VA hospital parking lot just as the morning shift change was happening. Nurses and doctors streamed in and out of the main entrance, their scrubs bright against the gray building. John noticed how Max tracked their movements, his training obvious in the way he assessed each person who passed near the truck. Richard was waiting for them at the entrance, clipboard in hand. He'd arrived early to smooth the way, working with hospital administration to get the necessary clearances. "Good morning," he said, his voice steady and confident. "Everything's in order. We just need to get through security and up to the ward." The hospital lobby was busy with visitors and staff, but Max moved through the crowd like a shadow, staying close to John's leg without touching anyone. His military bearing drew admiring glances from several veterans who recognized a fellow service member, even one with 4 legs. At the security desk, Richard presented their paperwork. The guard, a former Marine himself, looked over Max's credentials with professional interest. "Military working dog, huh?" he said, respect evident in his voice. "You boys go right ahead. I'll call up to let them know you're coming." The elevator ride to the 4th floor was quiet, filled with the kind of tension that comes before important moments. Max stood at perfect attention, his eyes fixed on the climbing floor numbers. John could feel the dog's anticipation building with each passing second. The ward nurse met them as they stepped out of the elevator. She'd been briefed about their visit and had helped prepare James for the reunion. "He's been doing better since we told him you found Max," she said softly to John. It's like knowing his partner was safe gave him new strength. They walked down the long hospital corridor, their footsteps echoing on the polished floor. Max's nose was working overtime now, and suddenly his whole body stiffened. Before anyone could say a word, a familiar scent had caught his attention. The change in his demeanor was immediate and dramatic. At the end of the hall, a door stood open. Inside, James Cooper sat in a chair by the window, looking thinner than in his photos, but with the same military bearing that spoke of years of service. When Max's nails clicked on the floor, James turned. Time seemed to stop for a moment. Man and dog locked eyes across the room, recognition blazing between them like an electric current. Then Max, the perfectly trained military dog who had maintained his composure through everything, broke protocol. With a soft whine that seemed to contain all the emotion of the past weeks, Max rushed forward. James slid from his chair to his knees, arms open wide. They collided in a tangle of fur and tears and joy, Max's whole body wiggling as he tried to get closer to his person, while James buried his face in the dog's neck. "I'm sorry, buddy," James whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm so sorry." Max responded by licking his face, tail wagging so hard his whole body shook. The reunion was everything John had hoped it would be. Pure, unfiltered love between a soldier and his faithful partner. The nurse wiped tears from her eyes as she watched. Even Richard, with all his years of helping veterans, had to clear his throat several times. John stood back, giving them space, feeling the rightness of this moment in his bones. When James finally looked up, his eyes were red, but his smile was genuine. "Thank you," he said to John, one hand still buried in Max's fur. "I don't know how I can ever repay you." John shook his head. "No repayment needed. I'm just glad we found him in time." He pulled out the chair next to James's bed and sat down, ready to share the story of finding Max and all that had happened since. The next hour passed quickly as they talked. James explained more about his situation, the illness that had blindsided him, the impossible choice he'd faced, and the depression that had followed being separated from Max. But now, with Max pressed against his leg and support services being arranged, there was hope in his voice. Richard outlined the program they'd found that would allow Max to stay with James during his treatment. The hospital administration, moved by their story and impressed by the community's support, had agreed to make special arrangements. As they discussed the details, Max never moved from James's side. His eyes remained fixed on his handler's face, as if making sure he wouldn't disappear again. The bond between them was almost visible, a testament to the years they'd spent depending on each other in the most dangerous situations imaginable. When it was time for John to leave, he felt a deep satisfaction. This wasn't just about saving a dog or helping a veteran, it was about preserving something precious and rare. The partnership between a soldier and his faithful companion, a bond forged in fire and strengthened by unwavering loyalty. Standing in the doorway, John watched as Max settled onto the bed beside James's chair, his head resting on his handler's lap. Both man and dog looked at peace for the first time since this whole story began. Sometimes John realized the best endings aren't really endings at all, they're just new beginnings in disguise. Over the next few weeks, the story of James and Max touched hearts throughout the community. Word spread beyond their small town, reaching local news stations and veterans organizations across the state. Each day brought new developments and small victories that showed the power of community coming together. John visited the hospital regularly, watching as James grew stronger with Max by his side. The German Shepherd had transformed from a guard dog to a therapy dog, instinctively knowing when his handler needed comfort or encouragement. During physical therapy sessions, Max would walk beside James, matching his pace perfectly, offering support both physical and emotional. The hospital staff quickly grew accustomed to seeing Max in the corridors. He became something of a celebrity on the ward, his presence lifting the spirits of other veterans who were also struggling with their own battles. Many would stop to share stories about their own service dogs or the animals that had helped them through tough times. One particular morning, John arrived to find James sitting in the hospital garden with Max at his feet. The autumn sun was warm, and there was more color in James's face than there had been in weeks. "The doctors say I'm improving faster than they expected," James said, scratching behind Max's ears. "They think having him here has made all the difference." The medical staff agreed. James's primary doctor had documented the positive changes since Max's arrival: better sleep patterns, reduced anxiety, improved appetite, and a renewed determination to get better. What had started as a special arrangement for one veteran and his dog was becoming a case study in the therapeutic value of keeping service animals with their handlers during treatment. Richard from the Veterans Support Network had been busy too. He used James and Max's story to highlight the need for better support systems for veterans with service dogs. His advocacy had caught the attention of state legislators who were now discussing policies to prevent other veterans from facing the same impossible choice James had faced. The local community continued to rally around them. The pet store owner, Tom, arranged regular deliveries of food and supplies for Max. Dr. Thompson provided free veterinary care. The hospital's maintenance staff even built a special ramp next to James's bed so Max could climb up more easily when his handler needed him close. One afternoon, a group of elementary school students visited the ward. They'd heard about Max and James's story and had organized a fundraiser at their school. The children had made cards decorated with paw prints and American flags, and their eyes widened with wonder as James explained how he and Max had worked together overseas. "Max wasn't just my partner," James told them, his voice strong with pride. "He saved my life more times than I can count, and he's still saving me every day." Max, sensing he was being talked about, sat up straighter, his bearing every inch the proud military dog. The children's visit sparked an idea. With help from the hospital's recreational therapy department, James began sharing his and Max's story with other veteran groups. He spoke about the challenges of returning home, the importance of asking for help, and the unwavering loyalty of a four-legged battle buddy. As James's health improved, plans for the future began to take shape. The Veterans Support Network had found an apartment complex near the hospital that welcomed service dogs. The manager, himself a veteran, offered James a ground-floor unit with a small yard, perfect for Max. Local businesses pitched in to help furnish the apartment. The hardware store donated supplies to build a custom kennel. A furniture store provided a comfortable bed and chairs. Even the local garden center contributed plants to make the small yard more homey. John watched all this unfold with a sense of quiet satisfaction. He remembered that rainy morning in the woods, finding Max tied to that tree, and marveled at how much had changed. The desperate act of a man trying to save his dog had transformed into a story of hope and community support. One evening, as John prepared to leave the hospital after another visit, James called him back. "You know," James said, his voice thoughtful, "when I left Max in those woods, I thought I was giving him his best chance. I never imagined I was giving both of us a second chance." Max, who had been dozing at James's feet, lifted his head at the sound of his handler's voice. The bond between them was stronger than ever, tempered by their separation and strengthened by their reunion. In Max's eyes, John could still see that same unwavering loyalty he'd noticed that first day in the woods. As John drove home that night, he thought about how sometimes the best acts of kindness are the ones that ripple outward, touching more lives than we can imagine. What had started as a chance encounter during a hunting trip had grown into something much larger, a reminder of the power of loyalty, community, and the unbreakable bond between a soldier and his dog. The autumn leaves were turning golden, and the air held the crisp promise of change. In a hospital room not far away, a veteran was healing, watched over by his faithful guardian. And in communities across the state, people were learning that sometimes the most important rescues aren't just about saving someone, they're about bringing them home. Spring arrived in Pine Creek with a burst of new beginnings. The small apartment James and Max now called home was filled with morning sunlight, warming the space where the German Shepherd lay beside his handler's favorite chair. 6 months had passed since that fateful day in the woods, and the transformation in both man and dog was remarkable. James had completed his treatment successfully, his health improving steadily with Max by his side throughout the journey. The apartment complex had become more than just a place to live. It had become a symbol of their fresh start. The small yard, now dotted with blooming flowers planted by neighbors, was Max's favorite spot for their morning routine. Their story had created lasting changes in the community. The VA hospital had officially implemented a new policy allowing service dogs to stay with their handlers during treatment, using James and Max's case as their model. Several other hospitals in the state had followed suit, recognizing the vital role these dedicated animals played in their handlers' recovery. John still visited regularly, usually bringing coffee and occasionally joining them for their morning walks. Today was special, though. It marked the official launch of the Cooper Max Initiative, a program James had created to help other veterans facing similar challenges with their service dogs. "I never thought our story would help so many others," James said, watching Max play with a new toy in their small living room. The walls were decorated with photos of their military service, alongside newer ones showing their journey of recovery. "Sometimes I still can't believe how everything turned out." The initiative had already helped 3 other veteran dog pairs stay together during medical treatments. Local businesses continued their support, with the pet store setting up a permanent fund for emergency veterinary care and supplies. The community's generosity had transformed one rescue into an ongoing mission of hope. Max had settled into his new role beautifully. While he maintained his military training, he'd also learned to be a therapy dog, not just for James, but for other veterans in the complex. His gentle presence had a way of calming those struggling with their own battles, and his success had inspired a regular therapy dog program at the VA hospital. Richard from the Veterans Support Network had become a frequent visitor, often bringing news of how their story had influenced policy changes. "You've started something important here," he told James during one visit. "People are finally understanding that service dogs aren't just pets, they're vital partners in recovery." The elementary school that had raised funds for them had adopted their cause, creating an annual project to support veteran dog pairs. The children's continuing interest led to James and Max making regular visits to local schools, sharing their story and teaching young people about service, loyalty, and the importance of community support. Dr. Thompson had documented Max's role in James's recovery, contributing to a growing body of research about the therapeutic benefits of keeping service dogs with their handlers during medical treatment. Her findings were being used to advocate for policy changes at medical facilities across the country. One sunny morning, John arrived to find James and Max preparing for a special presentation. They had been invited to speak at a national veterans conference about their experience. "Would you believe," James said with a smile, "that leaving Max in those woods would lead to all this?" Max, recognizing his name, trotted over to press against James's leg. The gesture was so familiar now, a constant reminder of their unbreakable bond. His coat was glossy and healthy, his eyes bright with contentment. No one would guess that this confident, well-adjusted dog had once been tied to a tree in desperate circumstances. The apartment complex had become a model for veteran-friendly housing. Other properties were consulting with the manager about implementing similar policies, creating more spaces where veterans and their service dogs could live comfortably. The small yard where Max played had inspired the addition of a community dog park, complete with specialized equipment for service dog training. James's health continued to improve, but more importantly, he had found a new purpose. Working with other veterans and their dogs gave him a mission that drew on both his military experience and his profound understanding of the human-animal bond. Max remained by his side through it all, still the faithful partner he had always been. The local veterinary community had embraced their cause as well. Dr. Thompson had established a network of clinics offering discounted services to service dogs, ensuring that no veteran would have to choose between medical care and keeping their faithful companion. Her initiative was spreading to neighboring counties, creating a safety net for veterans and their dogs. As evening approached, John watched James and Max preparing for their daily walk. There was an ease between them now, a comfortable rhythm born of years of partnership and strengthened by the trials they'd overcome together. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant colors, a fitting backdrop to their continuing story. "You know what Max taught me?" James said as they stepped outside. "That sometimes the darkest moments can lead to the brightest beginnings. We just have to have faith and accept help when it's offered." Max wagged his tail in agreement, ready as always to walk beside his handler wherever the path might lead. Their story had become more than just a tale of rescue. It was a testament to the power of community, the strength of the human-animal bond, and the extraordinary things that could happen when people came together to help one of their own. In Pine Creek and beyond, the legacy of a hunter's chance discovery in the woods continued to create ripples of positive change, one paw print at a time.